Okay. Uh, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker of today. And I'm flattered, not honored, that I was asked to do so. Um, as you are aware, he is an esteemed scholar by his work and a true cosmopolitan, both by his roots and affiliations. Uh, his point of gravity, so to say, is the University of Ulster at Antrim, where he holds the chair in political economy. But besides of affiliations with places so far apart as Witwatersrand and Reading. He was active in Canada, the US, the Czech Republic, Romania, and definitely more places the internet does not quote. Now, labeling his fields of research as political economy is a stark understatement, since I learned in preparing myself for today that he contributes to public choice, public sector economics, as well as law and economics, and that both with substantial issues as well as methodological contributions. But being a typical Austrian, I see an analogy of what George is doing with skiing. You're surprised? More specifically, alpine combined. There are few champions in this field nowadays, but George definitely is one, at least in economics combined, for his work. I could see Manfred's smile far away in his living room, all the way from Vienna, when he asked me to give this introduction. I think that he had in mind that Vienna is still pervaded by the winds of monarchy today, although it definitely is a republic. In Manfred's view, then, someone from such surroundings must be particularly fit to outline things to come during today's seminar. A typical example for the kind of questions George is going to tackle is the following. Why is it that Sweden, the incarnation of the social welfare state with a public spending quota considerably above 50% most of time, still has a king, whereas Austria, the manifest remains of the Habsburg Empire, is a republic, geared through parliament, a chancellor, and a president. But, I must add, noteworthy enough, Austria allowed for a state funeral for the late heir apparent of the House of Habsburg, Karl. Now, uh, the circumstances leading to such fundamental institutional changes, as George is going to tackle, are manifold and complex, as we will immediately learn. And it's amazing to see how George uses an analytical machete to cut out a path of explanations in the jungle of possibilities. I think that Gerard Gefgen, who substantially contributed to our understanding of institutional change, and of course, scholars like as Douglas North would be delighted to listen. And so the time has come to hand over to our speaker and ask him to address this experienced audience. I thank you very much.
Wolfgang, thank you very much for this introduction. You used a sporting analogy with ski. Now, you can't see me, but I'm blushing at this moment. I can only use a different analogy from football. I've never skied in my life. I'm too old to try now. Uh, to my children's delight, they can do something that I could not do when they were young. But my analogy is that if you buy a very expensive footballer, there is so much weight on the shoulders of the footballer to score, to deliver. And there is so much weight after that you said about somehow keeping you interested in what I'm going to say. So I'll try my best. Let me actually start the presentation. And survival, demise of European monarchies, and the emergence of constitutional monarchy. So the motivation, actually, Wolfgang has already talked about the motivation. We observed great waves of democratization in Western Europe, the move from autocracy to representative government. But in that actually wave of change, some of the old monarchies remained hereditary monarchies in the guise of constitutional monarchies, and other countries transitioned to republics. So the question is, despite the prevalence of liberal ideas, a number of hereditary constitutional monarchies still exist. Why? What is going on? Just to use some general definitions here, monarchy means, it's a Greek word actually, it means single person rule and connotes autocratic government. And certainly from the medieval times onwards, in Western Europe, it meant hereditary succession. Republic, I'm talking about a democracy here, and republic means the state where citizens authorize public officials to govern, and the head of state serves for a limited period of time only. Constitutional monarchy, in its broadest meaning, is monarchy regulated by rules. This is actually if you like, the data. This is what inspired, motivated the question. If I look at Europe at about actually the First World War, there are 21 states, give and take. Albania became an independent state after the war, and they were, all those states which I actually list here were monarchies, with the exception of France, which had already transitioned to a republic, but all others were monarchies. If we look at those countries now, then we can see only 8 monarchies, the ones in purple, right? They're only. What happened? Not only that, the countries which appeared in Europe over the 19th century, they were all set up, the new countries, they were all set up as constitutional monarchies or monarchies, and then they transitioned to constitutional monarchies. All countries which were set up in Europe after the First World War and after the Second World War were set up actually as republics. Why? What is going on? If I look at Europe around the First World War, just before, there were at the time 21 states, only 2 republics, and the republics were Switzerland and France. All other countries involved in Europe at the time were constitutional monarchies, or some type of monarchy, if not fully transitioned to constitutional monarchy. All states which were set up during the 19th century in the Balkans and in Belgium and so on in Scandinavia were all monarchies. All states which were actually established after the First World War and after the Second World War were established as republics. So what is going on? That's the motivation. If I look at the political economy questions, then probably there are 5 topics here. The profile of European monarchies during the 19th and 20th century, the sources of legitimacy of monarchy, then modeling is actually the closest that I can get to modeling is the stationary bandit model and the questions about rent seeking, the question of advantages and disadvantages of hereditary succession to office, what I call proximate and fundamental causes of the fall of monarchy, and the question of survival of kingship by transformation to constitutional monarchy. We apply political economy methodology, that is methodological individualism, rational choice, and politics as a change, and what we observe is an equilibrium state of affairs. This presentation will be more or less on 1, 5, and 6. That is the profile. We've already said a few things about it, and proximate and fundamental causes of the fall of monarchy and survival of monarchy by transforming to constitutional monarchy. So Again, a bit of information. In 2022, there are 41 European countries. I exclude the small ones, those with population less than 10,000 citizens. And the rest, we see the purple ones are the 8 monarchies which have survived. The the ones on the yellowish square or rectangle are countries which were monarchies at some point and then they stopped being monarchies. They transitioned to republics. And there is a number of what we may call new countries, right, which appeared and were set up as republics. Right. Having said that, the issue of importance is uh, the causes of the fall of monarchy. So, in an earlier uh, work, I distinguished between what I called proximate causes and fundamental causes. The proximate causes actually relate to the sequence of events which lead to the fall of monarchy and the rise of a republican order. The fundamental causes relate to why monarchy loses its legitimacy as a system of government. And the fundamental causes actually underpin the proximate causes. So what are proximate and what are fundamental? Oops. In talking about proximate causes, there are 4 of them: defeat in war, dissolution of the state or decolonization, revolution, and referendum. Typically, they work in tandem. We see that in practice, there is actually a combination of those factors which eventually ends with the abolition of monarchy. So a few details here. War defeat. The best examples: after the First World War, the kingdoms, empires of Russia, Germany, Habsburg, and Ottoman Turks dissolved. After the Second World War, it was the turn of Bulgaria, Italy, Romania, and Yugoslavia. The kings were booted out. Dissolution of the state. Again, the best examples are Russia, Germany, the Habsburg Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Here, with decolonization, I have in mind actually the UK, which had colonies within Europe. Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta are the examples here. Revolution and coups. This happened in France. That's before the 19th century, but I mean before the 20th century. Still, so be it. Quite a turbulent, actually, 100 years from the 1789 revolution up to the establishment of republic, which still carries on, although with different constitutions, 1870. So revolutions and coups in France, Portugal, Russia, Germany, again Ottoman Turkey, and Greece. Referendums took place in Italy, Iceland, and Greece, and I talk about referendums which were fair votes. There have been various referendums, but sometimes they were rigged. So we can be reasonably confident that the referendums that I refer here, for those 3 countries, were actually fair elections. So fundamental causes. Now, fundamental causes relate to the loss of legitimacy of monarchy. But that's not enough. There must also be a challenger who is strong enough to defeat the royal side. So what is loss of legitimacy? Just a few definitions again. By legitimacy, I mean that a decision maker is recognized to have the right to act as he or she acts. And we can distinguish between 2 types of legitimacy: what we may call systemic legitimacy, which is the belief that the existing political system is the appropriate for the society under consideration, even though outcomes may occasionally not be satisfactory. Performance legitimacy, that means popular support for the practical performance of the system. For example, the system actually has secured enough, sufficient growth so far, and it is parochial. The 2 are, of course, related. If performance legitimacy is found wanting for a long time, then it may actually raise questions of whether or not there is systemic legitimacy. So I'm mostly interested here in systemic legitimacy, why the monarchy may lose systemic legitimacy. So there are 2 broad sets of factors here for the loss of legitimacy. One is the loss of the divine status of the monarch, and the other one is the loss of the integrative role of the monarch. Uh, to understand best the former, the loss of divine status of the monarch, probably you have to go a long time back in history and understand that for a long period of time, monarchs were supposed to be incarnations of gods on earth. They were supposed to be representatives of gods, or somehow very much different from the common people. However, these attitudes and this kind of deference changed from basically from the Renaissance onwards as a result of new discoveries. I'm talking about geographic discoveries here. I'm talking about scientific discoveries like our planet Earth is not the center of the universe, and so on. So, new discovery, scientific knowledge, technological progress, also reasoning and rationality as it came into trying to understand the world, the social world, and the natural world, and of course, with wider consumer choice. Obviously, those factors are interrelated, but eventually they came up to say that the king, the royal family, is not a divine figure. More importantly for our actual inquiry is the loss of the unifying, the integrative role of the monarch. The monarchy, even if I don't see the monarch as a divine actually figure, it is still the case that the monarch may play the role of continuity of the society, of the community, may be an integrative feature, may be thought as a paragon of stability, and so on. However, the monarch will lose actually this role, this unifying role, because of ethnic divisions, because of partisanship of monarchy, specifically interference in everyday politics, and favoring a particular party, particular actually group of interests, because of royal corruption, and because actually of ideological reasons. And ideological reasons, of course, it's the idea that all public office should be contestable. All public offices should be contestable. There is no, why is there hereditary office, and it can, one may say, it culminates with communist ideology, virulent anti-royalist ideology. So these are the reasons why the monarchy may lose its legitimacy. Now, loss of legitimacy is necessary, but is not sufficient. There must be also a challenger who is able, well, willing, and of course able to challenge the monarch. So that actually brings us to the question about power. Where is the power of the monarch, and why the monarch actually can dominate? There are a few things that we can say, like the military strength. Typically, the king, because the king actually controls the military, the police, secret services, and so on, has an advantage here. Power also comes from wealth. I can buy mercenaries after all, or I can actually simply buy out others. The king has an advantage in terms of wealth. Typically, royal families are pretty wealthy. And the other issue is popular support. The challenger may have an advantage, may not. Right? That's why I've had it as plus and minus. The challenger always faces a collective action problem. That is, obeying the king is a Nash equilibrium. Why bother to revolt? We know that from Tallock and so on and so forth. So, the trying to overthrow the king has actually confronts big problems, right? Very severe problems. Nevertheless, having said that, now we can understand the sequence from fundamental causes to proximate causes to the fall of monarchy. So, for example, if I look at a war defeat, right, the European kings were fighting wars, and some of them were losing, some of them were winning those wars for a very long time. But it came a point where losing a war became pivotal in overthrowing the monarchy. Why? What happened here? So what I'm saying is that a war defeat signals the weakness, the military defeat, the weakness of the king. So the challenger now sees the opportunity. So the challenger in this way may solve the collective action problem, especially if you've got a large number of young conscripts who bear weapons. the challenger can more easily solve the problem of collective action under those circumstances. Also, under those circumstances, I can see that the elite may switch side against the royals and in favor of a different constitutional dispensation. Uh, Moreover, the growth of the middle class, especially the prosperity which came over with the industrial revolution and so on, means that it increased its ability to challenge the king, and also that was coupled with a demand for policy changes. So, with me demanding a stake in policy, I now question the legitimacy of the king being an absolute or almost absolute ruler. So, if the monarchy preserves its legitimacy, it survives as an institution. So the question is, how can the monarch keep her legitimacy when confronted by a crisis? To answer this question, I rely on Roger Congleton's King and Council template of governance, that all territorial governments actually can be thought as applying the template where there is a chief executive, call it a king, and a council members who uh, uh, somehow they are selected and they, with the king, decide policy. The decision, well, the weight of those two bodies may vary. There may be a lot of power in the hands of the single executive, or there may be a lot of power in the hands of the council. But they engage in a kind of joint, or if you like, power sharing arrangement. So, um, suppose that there is a crisis and the king needs more revenue. The crisis could be because the king simply wants to build a new palace, right? Trivial. Or the king is thinking of financing a war and so on. So when there is a crisis like that and the king needs more revenue, then there is opportunity for the challenger, somehow the council actually, to trade with the king. And now there are two possibilities. The king may fight against the council, who wants to negotiate with the king a new dispensation, a new power sharing arrangement, or the king may actually decide to trade. If the king fights, then either the king wins or the king loses. If the king wins, then absolute monarchy or something very similar to absolute monarchy prevails. If the king actually fights and loses, then the king is basically booted out, right? Loses her position. If the king surrenders some policy power, some policy making responsibilities to the challenger agrees more funds for the king, and now we have what is basically a mutually beneficial trade, or what actually Roger Congleton calls a constitutional exchange. And the end result of those constitutional exchange is that the king, the monarch, is now subject to rules. So we are moving on towards constitutional monarchy, a monarchy regulated by rules. Now, why monarchies may survive? In this rationale, they survive and they transform to constitutional monarchies because, in the face of demands by a strong challenger backed by credible threats, the king agrees to a reallocation of the power to decide policy and share office rents. So we have an exchange of rights in the political market. So I've got an exchange of political property markets, what actually Roger calls constitutional exchanges, constitutional bargains. And as we know from standard economics, the exchange is actually welfare augmenting for both parts. So the end result is that the monarch retains the crown and shares power with those who are able to mount a successful challenge. Historically, the exchange has been played over a long period, several rounds, and it is non-linear. It is not actually a one-way street, which will certainly end with constitutional monarchy. There are occasions where somehow the king is able to claw back some of the powers that surrendered at an earlier stage. Now, there is a formal model which discusses and analyzes this kind of exchanges and the end result towards a republic or absolute monarchy or constitutional monarchy. It's a recent actually paper of mine. So it is a model. It's basically a conflict model, conflict economics model. So the king and the liberal challenger coexist over a succession of periods and fight for power, which brings office rents and the right to decide one's preferred policy. So it's a two-dimensional choice here, and I think of it as a recursive actually model. It doesn't have to be the same person for the king and the same person for the challenger, but they play that game over several generations. The outcome of the confrontation is uncertain. Sometimes the king wins, sometimes the liberal opposition actually wins, and it may vary from period to period. So in this general model, whether constitutional monarchy is agreed depends on the marginal utilities from rents and policy preferences of the two players. It depends on the size of the benefits from office rents and from the benefits from implementing a player's desired policy. How big is actually the money that the king can get? How big is the rent actually that the king can retain? How important is the policy dimension, tax policy or foreign policy, whatever, that the king actually surrenders to the members, the liberal council, and so on. Of course, it depends on the rate by which the two players discount the future, and here there may be a big difference between the king and the liberal. The king may take a very long view. In other words, I am the king now. I've got a challenge. What do I want? Do I want actually to try and kill the opposition and be king until the end, or the end is actually my descendants, and so on and so forth, looking at the dynasty. So the rates of discount may differ, and of course the probabilities of prevailing in the conflict. So the contemporary European constitutional monarch, as a ceremonial head of state who reigns but does not govern, actually in this model comes up as a special case of the general model, which identifies those factors that I mentioned here as the important ones for whether or not constitutional monarchy. So constitutional monarchy, as we understand it in Europe, as we experience it in Europe at this moment, is one solution towards actually the end of the line of possible solutions that we have. Now, if we were actually to put things in a very descriptive way, then the constitutional outcomes and oops, there is a D missing here, type of office and method of selection. So what we've got here is the following thing. With constitutional monarchy, we have, if you like, two types of offices. We've got government and head of state. Now, bring into it the method of selection, which can be hereditary appointment to office or non-hereditary. And the non-hereditary can be actually divided into election method or somehow a takeover, a non-election method. So that gives us this table here, or this matrix. And the republic, right, or the democratic republic, is actually the case of having a government which of course is elected non-hereditary, and the head of state is elected a non-hereditary. The absolute monarchy, at the other side, at the other extreme of the diagonal, is hereditary government and hereditary head of state. Constitutional monarchy means that, as we said, the king reigns but does not govern. So I've got a government which is elected, and the head of state is unelected, but better to call it actually a hereditary as it is. Dictatorship is the case of unelected government and unelected head of state, or if we look at the cases of the Balkan kingdoms in the interwar period, and I'm talking about Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, as well as Greece, as well as Italy, then we can have a king, a hereditary head of state, and a dictator, like Mussolini, for example, or Metaxas in Greece, and so on and so forth. So, constitutional monarchy means a negotiated dispensation based on constitutional exchanges. The new constitutional monarchy equilibrium has the king reduced to a figurehead with a ceremonial role instead of wielding power to make policy. But the king keeps part of the office rents, exemplified by the civil list, the palaces, the patronage that the royal family actually can still exercise. And the challenger wins the right to govern, therefore decide policy, but concedes the birth privilege against liberal convictions. The reallocation of policy-making powers and the financial, the new division of financial resources between the king and the challenger represents a reassignment of political property rights, and the resulting equilibrium must be self-enforcing. There is no higher power above the king and above the challenger to implement their agreement. So both sides must be better off by the agreement to comply with its terms. The formal model shows that this is one possibility, it's one solution. Another solution, as we said, is to stay with the king to win and stay actually with absolute monarchy, or indeed the king to lose and transform to the republic. So, just a few conclusions. I found that, comparatively speaking, that should have been 22 here, not 21. All right, okay. That is a quotation from the Guardian newspaper, which is not actually such a big fan of the royal family of England, but it toes the line. It is as anti-royalist as it can possibly be, without being revolutionary. So, monarchy depends for public support not on votes, but on a fragile, intangible, and underpinning of public opinion. It needs to be loved for its dignities, the ceremonials, and so on. It must be beyond criticism, pure as a driven snow, and in this respect can be boring. Now, the one thing it cannot be is scandalous, right? So the scandal here, and what the author has in mind, was what has happened with Prince Andrew. So I'm not going to talk about this. I'm not going to do any kind of royal gossip, or at least this is not my intention. I simply want to put the conclusion here that monarchs who consented to a change in their power when circumstances changed, and especially they ceded power to those with the means to challenge the supremacy of kingship, preserved their crowns. Those monarchs who refused to negotiate did not credibly commit to the constitutional arrangements made with the challenger. They lost their crowns. So that is what I want to say, and I want to end with a quiz.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm done. I don't have anything else to say. I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Before we start the discussion, I would like to welcome Zhang Li from the University of Vienna. He did a PhD in Hamburg many years ago, and it's a pleasure to see him here. Vienna is not too far away from Beijing, so he's probably the furthest away person in here. Anyway, so well, we have a discussion now. Who wants to be king? Who wants to be queen? Let's start with that. Well, I have something to add to this, because I think it also depends whether there's a monarch or not, depends whether your neighbor is a monarchy or not. Look at Scandinavia, you know, I mean, Denmark has a queen, Sweden has a king, Norway has also something like that. And amazingly, when Finland became independent in 1918, they elected a king, the parliament, you know, they elected a king. It was a German prince called Karl, but the problem was they didn't find a boat to bring him over the Baltic. But the Finns also wanted to be a kingdom, and I think there are these effects, you know, that if well, you didn't have, I don't think you discussed it, you know, that if you have one kingdom, then the next state entity might consider also to have a king or a queen. nowadays, you know. But in old days, it was also a bit like that, you know. I mean, they created kingdoms. Well, think of Germany, you know. I mean, in the time of Napoleon, we got all these electors and all the dukes were promoted. Well, not all, but some of them were promoted to kings, you know. So, like in the state of Bavaria, you know. So this kind of promotion depends also on the environment, I guess. And of course, if in the environment, you know, kings and queens are no more fashionable, then it's also difficult for you if you're a king, you know, to keep your position, I think. So my hypothesis, there are some kind of, yeah, relationships, you know, which matter, whether you have a decrease in the monarchy or an increase, a demise. Okay, that was my comment, which you know, George, do you think it's relevant, you know, to have this kind of?
I do believe that the demonstration effect, which basically is that, you know, my neighbor is a kingdom, I'm going to be kingdom, is actually an important one. It didn't work like that. Look at, for example, France and Belgium, right? Very close to each other. Look at Portugal and Spain, very close to each other. Again, Spain and France. So it's if you like to put it like that, mixed evidence here. But it seems to me that the important point is legitimacy. So in the 19th century, there was basically only one type of legitimacy, and that is kingdom. Uh, Greece became an independent country, and it started the revolution against it. The revolution, in one way or another, was about to die until the so-called protectors of Britain, France, and Russia intervened. And the final constitutional arrangement for Greece was to be a kingdom. And from what we know at the time, Greeks were actually very happy to be considered as a kingdom because that meant that they were at par with the other European powers. So legitimacy is the important issue here. This is what I maintain. So it was the legitimate, the accepted format of government. Of course, the Greeks very quickly got rid of the German prince or the Bavarian prince that was appointed as a king of Greece at the time. And we've talked
But
about
not
that.
quickly. I mean, I think he was king for more than 20 years, wasn't he?
He was king from well, more than that. He was king from 1832 to 1862.
That's not quick.
He was forced to consider constitution in 1843.
Mm-hmm.
So he came as an absolute ruler. He really
Mm-hmm.
came. There are lots of important issues here. Why actually those monarchs fell. The If you look at the Balkans, they all imported their kings. Greece imported its king, German prince. Bulgaria imported its king, German prince. Romania imported its king, another German prince. There was no local nobility. The king, although the kings loved those countries, I have no actually problem believing in that. They did not have this kind of body of noblemen, the aristocrats, who could advise them, who could actually help them in finding suitable wives, in communicating with commoners, and so on. They were foreigners. In truth, they were foreigners in those countries. So the yes, I can see the legitimacy of it, but at the same time, I can see the non-legitimacy of it because they were not um, they were not actually indigenous institutions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can go on with the King of Greece, and I know a little bit about. Serbia was different. Serbia had actually two aristocratic families, right? The Karađorđević and the Obrenović, who were fighting for the throne. And what you observe in Serbia is kind of yo-yoing. Those two families alternate on the throne. They occasionally concede a constitution. Then the other family comes in and abolishes the constitution, and the cycle goes on and on like that. And it involved um, civil wars, it involved actually royal assassinations, and so on. But the Serbians did have something which was more or less equivalent or an analog to a local national aristocracy. The other Balkans did not have it. So odds were for the king not to survive. This is also a point which, at a different level and at a different kind of contact, was made by Dennis Muller, that the king relies on the upper house, the lords or whatever it is called.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, who wants to comment? Oh, Barbara. Okay.
Well, I have a I have a different question. I just wanted to ask George whether you think that the British kingdom will survive after Queen Elizabeth.
Right.
I mean, when
Right.
she
Okay.
after her death.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh dear. Is what I think or what I want. There is a difference between the two.
Well, tell us both. Tell us
I'm
both.
right. Okay. I am a pessimist, and I think that the English royal family will survive for a long time to come. When King Farouk of Egypt was deposed, he said in the next 50 years there are going to be only 5 kings in Europe: the King of England, well, Queen, right? King of England, and the 4 kings in the playing cards. He was wrong, but the idea of Britain not being, well, England not being a kingdom is not something which will be uh, which will materialize, if you like, in my life cycle, not during my living times. No, I think it will be transformed. It will actually it will face crisis, but I think it will survive.
Okay, then Mario Ferrero. Mario, you asked the question. You want?
Oh, yes, George, very interesting, but I have a problem here. Um, you characterized this power exchange or power game as a two-player game between a challenger, which is the elite, and the king. Okay.
Right.
Now that may be okay for the 19th century or even before that time, but I'm not sure it is appropriate for the 20th century because in many cases, I think there was a three players game. Uh, there was the elite, the traditional elite or the property classes, the king, and the labor movement threatening a revolution. You know, this is a different thing, which allows for possible coalitions between any two of those three, right? Think
Right.
of Germany at the end of World War One, or Hungary at the same time after the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, or Italy at the very end of World War One. A big thing about that was that if the economic and social elite was too keen about, too hard in bargaining with the king, they were exposing themselves to the risk of what they saw as a threat of expropriation, right? A socialist revolution, things like that. That is very important. So I think a three-player type of thing would more accurately capture the 20th century situation as opposed to the previous times. And that is, by the way, that is also, I think, something that Roger Congleton misses in his book. The book is very valuable, of course, but this side of the problem, not unsurprisingly, if you know him, is something that escapes him. Yeah.
I think, yeah, thank you. That's a good question, a valid point. But actually, there's more than one here. There are more than one point here. It is, I think, we also talked about that last week. It's always easier to reduce the game as well between two players, right? One thing. Second, if I look um, at the question of the king losing the throne, then I don't think that they're saying anything different. Whether or not the revolutionary is in parliament or is trying to get access to parliament, and the revolutionary is actually losing or is not allowed to get into parliament and has no other option but to go to revolution, again, I have two players really. If you like, the parliament, the council, has become is totally dominated by the king. Therefore, having no other option, the revolutionaries revert to some kind of violence. Nevertheless, the revolutionaries usually come from the middle classes or even higher classes, and they simply want a stake in power. Now, if I look at revolutions do not establish democracy. No revolution established democracy. Why? Because it's a violent event, and you have to overcome the collective action problem. The leaders of the revolution rely on a close, actually a small, closed circle of friends. They work secretively, and when they get power, the last thing that they have in mind is to actually share this power with others. So revolutions do not lead to democracy. In fact, if you like, democracy leads to a revolution in the sense of changing attitudes, changing the social structure, and so on. So I am quite happy keeping the model as two players. Uh, uh, the um, I think what is to go back to Roger's work. I think what Roger's book cannot answer is the success of the French Revolution. What happened there? Why there was no bargaining? Having done a bit of reading about it, actually a lot of reading about it, it seems to me that if I were to put it in Roger's terms, what happened was that the king had nothing to negotiate with. Nothing. So the revolutionaries, who were actually primarily people from the nobility, simply got rid of him. There was nothing that the king could give them in exchange of a higher tax revenues. That had to do with the way that France was actually structured from the medieval times to Louis XIV and so on. So yes, it is valid to think of three different players. It seems to me, however, that it is quite okay to reduce the three players into two because of the various coalitions which come up. And that is, if I understood your question correctly.
Just a second. In the case of the French Revolution, the third player was just not there. It didn't exist anything like an organized labor movement at that time. But think about the end of World War One. Do you think that the German elite, the big property classes, were against the Kaiser? The fall of the monarchy was due to the threat of revolution. The revolution itself was crushed, as we know. But even though it is true that the leaders or the organizers of the labor movement are typically intellectuals or middle class people, still their basis of support is in the unions and not in the middle classes. This makes a fundamental difference. They forced the resignation of the Kaiser in Germany, and by the way, also in Italy at the end of World War II, because those who had fought the partisan war against fascism and the German occupation in the last stage of the war would not tolerate a kingdom anymore, and those were the socialists and the communists, not the middle class.
Mario, absolutely so. The king, the
Giorgio
monarchy
wants to contribute.
lost its the monarchy has lost its legitimacy.
Correct. Giorgio?
Yeah, may I add something to the argument raised by Mario that there are more than two players? Not, for example, I'm thinking of the case of Spain, that it's a most recent creation of a monarchy in Europe. But then there was at least a third player, which was the army, Mm-hmm. And in fact, the army made an agreement. No, I mean, there was an agreement between, the two main political parties, or at least the big players. Is famous. The communists, on the one hand, that were against the monarchy but wanted recognition. Sorry, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite nice.
And the Neo-Francoist party, which was for the monarchy but was against the recognition of the Communist Party. So at least there were three players in the same. Thinking of back to the case of Italy, which was remembered by Mario. Italy after the First World War. Also, the army was I guess was a key player in the survival of the monarchy at the time. Also because Italy had, so to say, won the war. So the monarchy had the support of the army. And going back, of course, everybody has his personal case, but possibly also in Germany, I wonder what was the role played by the army after the First World War in the keeping of removing the monarchy. And another, just to terminate, I was thinking to the small. Let's say, kind of monarchical states that were in central Italy between the Congress of Vienna and the creation of Italy in 1861. I am referring to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and the two duchies of Modena and Reggio and Mantua on the other hand. And the bigger player that was an external monarchy which had an interest to keep control Italy by fragmentating the territory in a small state and putting them at the head of them an external dynasty, not because mobility was missing, but because of control. Okay. Then first, last. To some extent, to think, not to refer to the elite. It's something that itself is also, to me, something not enough or too simplistic. For example, again, referring to Italy and to Spain, what was the elite? Did the elite, what was the elite? What the elite included? The liberal elite, the economic elite in general was for the republic. Anyway, it was different. It had different opinions and preference about monarchy and the republic from the landowner class. And if you add the army, which usually is also included in the elite of a country, the army has interest and preference which differ from the landowning classes and from the liberal and trading and economic classes. So concluding, I guess there are so many stakeholders and players, and compared to the limited number of cases that, I mean, it's hard to make, general conclusion and prediction. Okay.
George, you want to react on this?
I don't have anything to say. I don't have anything to add to this one. Yes, it is case specific. What I've tried to say is that uh, when the monarchy as a system of governance loses its legitimacy, it is doomed. If the king or the queen makes successful trades with those who want a stake in public office, then the monarchy survives. Now, uh, uh, I use the canvas of the king and council um, architecture of government because it is useful, because it is in a way very easy to model, and because it actually gives me a way to understand how countries democratized. The democratization meant that the council itself, the council of the king, became more and more representative. For the European countries that we look at, those who were trying to change the constitution by revolutionary means did not end up as democracies. They ended up as totalitarian states of one hue or another. They ended up as dictatorships, right? So, but the 8 which survived became actually constitutional monarchies. They've got their own differences, right? Some of them written on hard constitutions, others actually a little bit woolier, but they are constitutional monarchies. So my question was, if I am someone who has an egalitarian ideology, and I think that the principle of hereditary office is against the egalitarian principle of competition, how comes and I accept a dispensation where I keep the king? And I think the best way to understand that is the constitutional bargains. I may not like it, the king does not like me, but eventually we come to an equilibrium which is self-sustaining. It's better than fighting all the time.
Mm. Okay, Shanti Chakravarti wanted to talk, I think, 10 minutes ago, but now I cannot see his picture. I don't know whether he's still here. Maybe he has coffee now or so.
No, I'm still
Shanti,
here,
are you around?
but I'm
Shanti,
still
you
here, but
wanted to
I'd
ask
rather
a question?
listen. I'd rather
Shanti?
listen to other people.
Okay, okay.
I'd rather listen to other people now.
I
you.
understood. Okay,
Yeah.
Shanti.
Right.
Okay.
I think Barbara should go back to all those people who are in one way or another based in Britain and ask them the same question. What is their view about the future of the royal family in Britain, in England? Better to call it England.
Yeah. But now, of course, we should ask Wolfgang. I mean, he did a nice introduction. And of course, he's more familiar with your presentation than most of us, better. Wolfgang, okay, you're an Austrian, so you have a lot of experience with monarchies. And I mean, the emperor had the crown of Hungary, of Poland, and all kind of, so there were staples of crowns,
There's a lot of things which come to my mind just to sort out. The first thing is I always liked Gordon Tullock's theory of revolution because it basically states that when you expect that the gains when you invest in change, which is very costly and exhausting, get rent for you, then you will do it. But you need to accept the status quo when you see that it doesn't pay off. So, and that is a kind of reasoning you are all familiar with. My sophisticated question would be, could it be that today's republic turns into a constitutional monarchy again, so that the reverse happens. What we observe and what presently concerns us very much is that the world is, so to say, challenged by dictatorships. But we think of a more, say, of a level of agreement, and therefore the question is whether that could happen. And I remind you, and then I'm stopping, that many people say that or see it like that the American president is some kind of king elect. So it is not so obscure that we might see reverses of the development as well, not only the things you pointed out to us so eloquently today.
Okay, thank you, Wolfgang. Of course, the American president in the draft of the Constitution had no final term, you know. He was considered so to be a kind of reserve king, you know. But then the Constitution works differently. But as far as I know, the plan was, you know, to elect him and then he goes on lifelong, you know. But that's a different story. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Any other question, remarks?
Can I actually go back to that's the most interesting question that Wolfgang just raised, right? From republic, now talking about moving from republic to monarchy. It has happened. It happened in France, right? From the first republic, Napoleon takes over. Then the second republic, another Napoleon takes over, right? So it has happened. It happened in Spain, right? There was a republic, then there was a civil war. Actually, it happened twice in Spain because the monarchy in Spain was abolished in the late 19th century. The queen actually was expelled, and the republic only lived for 1 year. And then, of course, we had actually the republic in the 1930s, and it ended with a war where actually the army eventually took a royalist position. I mean, it's not only the trivial thing that Franco was a supporter of Real Madrid, the football team. It was also the case that Franco anointed a successor who was actually a royal prince. So go back to Giorgio's actual question of a few minutes ago, the army sided with the king in this respect. Greece went through the same experience. Greece actually was a republic between 1924 yes, constitutionally, until 1935. And then the king came back in 1935. It was actually the same king, King George, who again left Greece when the Nazis took over, and he returned. And eventually, it was his nephew who was the last king of Greece, who expelled him. Lost the referendum in 1974. So we've got historical precedences of the republic becoming monarchy again. Can we rule it out for the future?
But in Greece, of course, there were outside
regret,
power.
I would say with regret, we cannot rule it out. With regret, I don't think we can rule it out. We don't know what the future holds in this respect. I can see actually the future other countries outside Europe saying we are no longer having the Queen as our head of state. Canada, Australia are good examples here. We know that it happened in the Caribbean only a few weeks ago. So I can see other ex-colonies saying, okay, that's enough. We're going to have our own president, or whatever they're going to call actually the head of state. And I cannot see actually those countries coming back, adopting a monarchical, constitutional monarchical form or anything like that. I can't think that if Australia becomes a republic, then there are circumstances where they will readopt a royal family as head of state.
But you see,
I cannot rule it out.
I'm sorry. In Greece, of course, it were outside powers, France and England, who made it a monarchy.
Yes.
Yeah.
That shows actually. That shows how.
Over, I mean, it's yeah.
I'm sorry, Manfred, I lost you.
No, I
became,
mean, in Greece, you know, there were outside powers. I mean, there were
yes,
England, Britain, and France who decided it should be a monarchy, and
yes,
these also should be king, you know.
yes,
So it didn't came from inside, you know.
exactly,
So
exactly,
you
yes.
have cases, when you go back in history, you find very often that monarchs were, so to say, installed, you know, by outside
Yeah.
powers, you know, say now
Yeah.
you go there and you're king there, and so, you know.
Yes, yes.
That's why we have very often they had the case that the king doesn't speak the national language. I mean, I think it took 2 or 3 Georges before the first one really spoke English, you know.
No, even George III. George III was born in England. He was the first Hanoverian who was born in England. His father, Frederick, who was supposed to become king, died before because George's actually grandfather, who was George II. George I, George II were actually German princes from Hanover. George III was born in Britain, but from what I understand, he always had a German accent, and it was more or less compulsory to get married to a German princess, which he did. So George IV was fully um, assimilated to Britain at the time, and of course the royal family kept their German name all the way to the First World War. They changed the family name to Windsors because of the First World War, Germany versus Britain. So, yes, I mean, Germany was kind of supplying princes to occupy thrones all over Europe.
Yeah. So what? Okay. I think it's time to thank the speaker and Wolfgang Weigel for the introduction, and those who discussed and those who listened, you know. So we all say thank you to each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thank you for.
We'll see you on Monday again. Huh?
Thanks
Yes.
to you.
Bye.
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 It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.